So now that we have a working URL shortener, one main improvement we want to make is to replace the default API gateway URL with our own custom domain. And one of the first things we need is a actual domain. So if we open up Route 53, just gonna open this up in a new tab, or we can just star and click from here. And you do need a domain, right? So if you go to register domain, and this will come at a cost. So if you want to purchase your domain, I already have one that I use for other applications. So if we go to domains over on the left, go to registered domains, and we're gonna hit on register domain, and here we can search for any particular domain you want to buy. So let's just see what a short URL would look like. Of course, if you have a domain on GoDaddy, you could transfer it over into Route 53. We're not going to cover that in this tutorial. And if you want to buy a domain, it's as simple as just clicking select and proceed to checkout. And it's pretty much just a 5-step process. You enter your personal information, you get that domain, and it will show up in your Route 53 dashboards. So let me leave. Once you have a working domain, I already have one, you'll see on your dashboard the hosted zone. And if I click into that hosted zone, click on the domain, I will see all the records that come as part of my domain. Now, one of the cool things here is I can create additional subdomains pretty easily. And if you, especially if you're using your top level domain, probably for our website, you can actually create additional domains. So there's a few things we need apart from the domain itself. We need a cert, a ACM certificate. Now there is a service certificate manager. So let's tap that as well. And we're going to open that in a new tab. And you'll see that in the past, I've created a api.mydomain.com along with a certificate. And this is, again, free. You can automate this whole process, and that's what we'll do. So let's jump over to our template and start creating some of those resources. I'm just going to open my template.yaml, and we're going to actually use parameters just to make this a lot more cleaner. So I'll need a subdomain of type string, and I'll set the default value to, I'm going to call it url.myactualdomain which is beams.com. We also need a hosted zone ID. That again is a type string, and the default, we can grab that from the dashboard. So if we go back to Route 53, and click on your hosted zone, open up your domain. This actually has an ID. So if we collapse the hosted zone details, we want to grab this ID. We also need the full qualify domain name. In this case, I'm calling it subdomain. And this is pretty much identical to the values here, with the difference we using the dot, so we have the full name. And we also need the name that's associated with the hosted zone, which is your top level domain name. So we're going to grab that value. We're going to say and we're going to put the full qualifying name, which usually just a standard to keep the dot. So those are the 3 main or 4 main values we need for now. So one of the first thing we need is a cert. So this is, let's call this API cert. and of type AWS certificate manager. Certificate. And let's add some properties. Domain name. We're going to use the subdomain since, so yep. Here again, if we were using our domain name, we'd just be using that. But we want to create a subdomain for our API. So let's reference that subdomain. We need a domain validation option. And again, we want to pass in the same subdomain or domain name. And let's also pass in the hosted zone ID. And let's see what we actually call that variable. And we need the validation method to be DNS. And this will allow it to, once we create that domain, that certificate, since Route33 own the domain, this will automatically validate and show authorization. We also need a HTTP API domain. So your API, if we look over, let's open up our API. You'll see there is a section for custom domain names. And this is where we'll see custom domain names. We already have one for another API, and we can create them from here. Of course, we're automating this process. So let's create a HTTP API domain name of type AWS API Gateway v2, and it's a domain name. Let's add some properties. Domain name. We're going to reference our subdomain. We also need domain name configuration. And let's pass in the certificate. Now we're going to reference our HTTP certificate so we can dynamically get that value. Endpoint configuration. And these, you can actually get this complete structure from the documentation. And will be a regional. And this should be on the level of a resource. So make sure your indentations are correct. There we go. So here, let's take a look at what we have. We have a cert that maps to our domain, and we are creating a custom domain for our API. We also need a record for our subdomain. So let's do a record API domain. And this will be of type AWS route 53 record set. And let's add some properties. And properties we need in this example is the hosted zone name. And again, we use the full qualifying domain name for the hosted zone name. Clean this up a bit. We also need the name itself of the record set, which would be the API or url.beam.com. So this is the full qualifying domain. So we're going to reference that. And it is a type of a record. So a record needs the alias target. And this would be a DNS name. Now, when we have been using, so we've been mostly using ref to get a value. We can actually use the get attribute, and it pretty much does what the name says. It gets a attribute from a resource. And so we want to get from our HTTP API domain name, we want to grab the regional domain name. Let's see, we also need to point to the hosted zone ID. And we're going to use a get attribute again from the same HTTP domain. We're going to get the regional hosted zone ID. And let's also add a flag for evaluate L target. And so this should be false. So Road Tree has a lot of features, right? So you can perform L checks if you want to maybe have different type of traffic move from one domain to the next. We're not going to go into all of that. We're just keeping this pretty bare bone to what we need. So let's recap again. We have a certificate that maps to the domain. I'm creating a subdomain, which is the only reason why we're creating a record set. If I was using the top level domain, I wouldn't have probably need this. So this creates a record. And the next thing we need now is some type of mapping that maps the subdomain to the API. So we're going to call that HTTP API map of type AWS API gateway, and result is going to be v2 API mapping. And let's add some properties. API ID, we want to reference our API, so make sure we grab the correct logical ID. Right, so let's reference that. We want to also add the domain, subdomain, and this stage. And we also remember we actually create a flag for stage, so that should be good. And that should be it. Let's take a look. Also, remember in our code, we actually set a flag for when the stage is dev. We will put the stage name in the URL. So we'll need to update that. But let's just see if the resource gets created and if it maps to the API. So I'm going to save this.